All right. Now my pleasure to bring to you my first child and his paper, Love Trumps Reason, or Reason Trumps, or Love Reasons Trump, or whatever. So, all right.
Love Trumps Reason. A medium-sized man with Florentine garb of the 13th century begins to wander through a mysterious wood. He seems to be lost, both in thought and place. He begins to be led by his fear of ignorance to a mountain of awareness. There he meets his teacher, Virgil, who leads him from ignorance to reason. The most interesting development in this journey, however, is when Dante leaves reason and goes to the passionate irrationality of God. This part of the journey begins in purgatory, and so too shall the story begin.
Hey, could you speak up a little bit?
As Dante enters purgatory, at first glance it seems to be a transitory period, in which the only important step is Dante's safe passage from hell to heaven. While purgatory is a fleeting element of the story, it is by far the most revealing of Dante as a writer and a man. The difficult questions raised by the realm of transition are the decisions that separate one rational individual from another. In hell, Dante reveals much of his ideology, but he personally does not undergo much specific change. Purgatory is where Dante conjoins the fictional character of the story with who he is in reality. Dante meets many people from his non-fictional life in hell, but only met Beatrice, the most influential person in his real life, once he reached purgatory. The first item of importance to note in purgatory is the order of the mountain. Purgatory is divided into several deftly devised punishments based on the main groups of transgression. As wisps of humans move up, slowly clearing away their sins by order of grievousness, they become transformed into full beings ready for heaven. The order of purgatory is not a detail to move the plot on, but one of the clearest ways to understand Dante's beliefs and mind. Items such as the fact that purgatory is not hell in reverse can throw light upon Dante's idea of both realms. The first group within purgatory is made up of those who left God and the church for a temporary time. They are left at the foot of the mountain in anti-purgatory. When they still were as far, after we'd spanned, that is, what here we'd call 1,000 paces, as a stone was cast from a good slinger's hand, they all shrank up to the tall rock that rises in towering height there, and stood huddling, checked, like one who walks perplexed and stops and gazes. Dante says that the worst sin of all is tasting God's love and rejecting it. The transfiguration into sheep of those who forgot God is a literal reminder of God's grace, even for his sheep who have gone astray. Even the worst sinners in hell have never experienced God's love, so they at least have some justification for their sin. But the light punishment of being a sheep is startling, especially after the climactic scene at the end of hell. Dante uses his contrast to shock the reader into realizing that while the sins committed by saved and unsaved alike may be similar, the difference between them is that one leads to eternal redemption and the other leads to damnation. Dante emphasizes the distance between saved and unsaved by showing the vast ravine of difference in the consequences for both. The next terrace of Dante's journey takes him to the pasture of those who have waited long in life before repenting of their sins and becoming followers of God. They must lounge about and wait because of how they waited in life before they can journey any further on their path towards heaven. The indolence in which the punished lived is faithfully emphasized, as their journey goes from difficulty to ease the further they push through pain and climb. The mount is such, he answered, that those starting at the foot is hard in the extreme. The more they climb, the easier it grows. Therefore, when the ascent of it shall seem right pleasant to thee, and the going smooth as when a boat floats downward with the stream, the sun beats down on the punished with southern heat that dolens the mind, yet they still wish for the sweet, redeeming pain of higher purgatory, rather than dull lack of desire for heaven. All of the souls in Dante's purgatory have the ultimate yearning for God, but the spirits in anti-purgatory do not even love God yet. Dante understands Christianity as a much wider seeking towards God, rather than a faith made up of those who have been cleansed enough to love God himself. Dante believes that love is a way of reaching the ultimate goal of becoming in accordance with God, just as reason leads to love. While there are a wide variety of sins and corresponding punishments, the dividing line between hell and purgatory is by far the most indicative of the poet's belief concerning salvation. The fact that the souls of the late converted desire God but come short is a precursor of Dante's desire for Beatrice that leads him to God. Dante passes through the souls who were not given last rites in death, and several more layers of higher goodness. And then he comes into a surprising turn of events. He asks if all prayer is powerful, and Virgil finally becomes insufficient for Dante's questioning, so Dante needs to begin looking forward to Beatrice. But after this progression of the eternal plot, Dante's external struggle with the state of Florence and Italy as a whole becomes painfully evident hundreds of years after. The greed and strife between Florence and the various city-states of Italy disgust Dante, as he remarks that citizens cannot live in peace. O house of grief, O blonde slave Italy, ship without a pilot in a raging gale, no mistress province but stews in the sty. Dante seems often to use the Divine Comedy as an escape from the strife that he speaks of in Italy, but Canto 6 is more of an outlet for his frustration than an escape. The need for such an escape is only natural, and especially effective since many of the same corrupt government officials that Dante defames read his work once it is published. Dante does not seem to hold any one government over another, but rather his view of human reason running government as a whole is intensely cynical. After a few more days of traveling, sleeping Dante is brought by a giant eagle to the gate of Purgatory proper, where he is greeted by Saint Lucy and marked with the sign of the 7 cardinal sins. After this, he crosses the 3 steps of Purgatory, and the gate is opened with the keys of Peter. All of this at first seems to be a pointless plot contrivance to carry Dante from one point to another. The eagle which carries Dante to the gates is used throughout the Divine Comedy as a symbol of the true Roman Empire, in which Jesus is a Roman, which was certainly a dream for Dante, as he's already mentioned his disgust with the Italian factions. The 3 marble steps are the most fundamental steps of Christianity. In action, realization of sin, mourning, and the pouring of Christ's and one's own blood for restitution. Dante crosses in through the gates of Purgatory and immediately sees large marble statues that show people such as Trajan and Mary who exhibit great humility, which is meant to bring shame and provide examples to the souls of the prideful. The other sinners in anti-Purgatory were on the borderline of having faith at all, but past the gate of Purgatory, everyone is fully saved. However, those with pride are forced to carry massive rocks on their head to enforce the opposite virtue of humility into them. Dante seems to be showing that pride is the worst crime that can be committed against God or humanity when he meets the nobleman Franco, who constantly shifts his attitude between prideful and humble. Franco reminds Dante that the root of pride comes doubly from Eve, once from the fruit she took, and once from forgetting the rest of her offspring. As Dante leaves the level of pride, the angel of humility erases the P of pride from his forehead, and as soon as said action is completed, Dante's journey becomes much lighter. The second P becomes removed after seeing examples of envy, and Virgil begins to lecture Dante on selfless love and sharing, the opposite of what Dante just saw in the envious. Not only is Virgil beginning the first in a series of lectures, he is also conditioning Dante to be handed off to Beatrice later in his journey. Dante has already physically come into God's kingdom, but is still with Virgil, who represents earthly wisdom. Judging merely from where the dead are placed, Virgil would not even cross the river into Purgatory. By all rights, Virgil should have left Dante after hell, but there is a reason that he's Dante's companion even after crossing into the mountain of the saved. By bringing Virgil into Purgatory, Dante is showing his personal reluctance to give away his wisdom and self-reliance to love what God has given. Even though Dante has already physically entered Christendom, as many new Christians do, he is still led primarily by his own desire for truth, represented by Virgil, rather than the pursuit of heaven. Virgil has been the teacher of reason for Dante, so when he begins to speak of the nature of love to Dante, it is only natural that he would listen to his new and intriguing subject. However, Dante slowly loses his first excitement for Virgil to the extent that he simply falls asleep on the warm ground. Virgil points out to Dante's deaf ears that loving deserves no more praise than a bee earns for making honey, because love is a prime volition of humanity. If Dante had been listening, he would have discovered one of the most important parts of his journey, the fact that it is not love itself, but its direction that determines the path of the believer. Dante's later infatuation with Beatrice is not holy in itself, but it is holy in that it is the primary impetus towards God. Virgil is teaching that human action is depraved in essence, but when directed towards God it becomes holy by association. When Dante first begins to follow Virgil, it is with a sense of awestruck wonder and almost worship. But now he does not even give a thought to falling asleep as Virgil tells him important existential information. This is simply the next step in Dante's progression from human reason and self-certainty into being led only by love for God's creation. Being fully engaged in the physical and social aspects of life is a necessary part of truly understanding God. Illustrating the opposite of what Virgil is speaking of, while Dante is disrespecting his old teacher, a group of rowdy and very socially involved spirits begin running around him. All of the spirits running around Dante are being punished for their escapism and tolerance in life, exactly the opposite of what Virgil is speaking of, as well as what Dante is striving towards. Disengaged rationality is a strong desire for many world-weary intellectuals, and Dante seems to be no exception. The lack of involvement with humans is something that Dante deeply understood and firmly engaged in his personal life. Dante became exiled from his home city of Florence and surely felt the desire to leave the world of the physical and immerse himself in his books. The good fight is not fought in flights of philosophical fancy. There is a necessary base of reason to act wisely, but the work of God is an inherently physical act. As Dante is contemplating the disconnect between the cranial and the beautiful of physical life, purgatory begins to shake with a vengeance and harass Dante's mind from its wanderings. The spirits all throughout purgatory immediately begin to sing and shout, "Gloria in excelsis Deo!" And Dante and Virgil are shaken by the rumbling of the earth and held there by visceral awe. Every previously mournful soul drops its temporary burden and leaps with joy in anticipation of their future freedom. Statius, a poet who imitated Virgil's style and was inspired to faith by Virgil's writings, tells both of the men to rise up from their fear, because what they just witnessed is merely the mountain celebration of a soul being released. Statius joins the two other poets because he's just finished clearing his avarice, and they all walk to the gluttons, and they see that now they have the sign of homo, or the Latin word for man, on their faces, because of how gluttony represents the sin that made all mankind fall. The punishment for the gluttonous is a tantalizing tree, which is an offshoot of the tree of good and evil, hearkening back to the desire for power and wisdom that led Eve to pluck the fruit. Adam and Eve were content in their natural state for God, but it was the desire to have more knowledge and rise above the union of body and spirit that caused them to sin. The gluttony that is being reprimanded in purgatory is not merely an act of eating an immense quantity of food, which is surely not a sin, but a desire for knowledge or aforementioned food that comes as the result of a mental desire to replace the bounty of God with excess of another kind. In each of Dante's abundant, well-crafted punishments for sin, he aims to show the disordered nature of the mind behind each act, rather than the state and obvious claim against the physical action. The poets move on and leave their conversation behind, and Statius and Dante move to a new topic, about the transition from a body into a soul after death. Meanwhile, they see examples of lust who run by each other and are able to quickly touch before moving on, never satisfied. After seeing this apparitional example of unhealthy connection to flesh, Dante is forced to trust his body to the cleansing flame of purity. Because he is extremely fearful of going through the wall of flame, he needs the prodding of Virgil through Beatrice's name. As soon as Dante pushes through the purifying flame, Virgil revokes his office as mentor of Dante and says that he can no longer teach, an action long hinted at throughout purgatory. Virgil stays with Dante into the meadow of earthly paradise, but then cruelly pranks Dante by disappearing just as Dante sees Beatrice for the first time and tries to share his excitement with Virgil. Beatrice's first action is to reprimand him for missing his former master. This is illustrative of his relationship to Beatrice for the rest of the series. Beatrice treats Dante like a child and reprimands him for his misunderstanding, while Dante follows after her worshipfully. Because the adoration of Beatrice leads Dante to God, in the end it is often seen as something healthy in itself. Throughout Paradiso, Dante shows such slavishness in his devotion that it can be said almost to be undeservedly bestowed upon Beatrice. However beautiful the result is, the natural discomfort that occurs when reading the account of Dante's devotion is not unintentional. Dante means to give the reader some qualms about the amount of worship. This claim has not often been taken up, but it seems to be the most consistent with the rest of the Divine Comedy. Just as hell was a means into purgatory, and purgatory into heaven, so was Beatrice to God. There's nothing that makes Beatrice herself more than another channel to God. The poet attempts to show this by contrasting security in God with the grasping for more and love of Beatrice. No place shows this more clearly than the beginning of Paradiso, where Beatrice is looking at the sun, and Dante is barely able to gaze at the brightness of the sun, so he looks at Beatrice and revels in her beauty. Beatrice proceeds to lecture Dante about the order of his universe. It seems as though the poet has gone too far in his instantaneous adoration of Beatrice, ever since he first met her in Purgatory. But the proper reading of the text requires some background on Dante's life. Dante met Beatrice at the age of 9, and thenceforward she represented to him the ideal of beauty, and was the subject of his ideal love for the rest of his life. It is possible that Dante also met Beatrice at their family's summer homes in the outskirts of Florence. Dante saw Beatrice several times throughout the rest of his life, and each time was a revelation for him. Dante eventually married another woman, Gemma, but the ideal of the unattainable courtly love is what drove Dante. Dante seemingly goes from overvaluing reason to overvaluing his emotion of adoration for Beatrice. It seems more likely that Dante's over-pursuit of Beatrice is based on his false idea of Beatrice's perfection rather than his emotions. The emotion of adoration is a powerful thing, but it cannot compel without the constant illusions of thought. As said by C.S. Lewis, without the aid of trained emotions, the intellect is powerless against the animal organism. No emotion is in itself a judgment. In that sense, all emotion and sentiments are illogical. The heart never takes the place of the head, but it can and should obey it. The issue with Dante's love for Beatrice is not that he loves her too much, but that he idealizes her into an image of what she is not. Every emotion that is given humans is pure in its heavenly form, but becomes corrupted by man's reason. The first item of note concerning Dante's heaven is that it is not as one place of equal benefits for all those who are saved. Just as Dante has a witty counter-punishment for each of the sins in purgatory, he also has a corresponding blessing for each predominant virtue. One of the common outrages concerning this is the idea that Jesus saved all with his blood, and they are saved accordingly. The explanation of the Christian life without afterlife consequence, regardless of its theological accuracy, seems to be lacking a bit of necessary motivation towards good actions. It is possible for a Christian to be driven towards God by their gentle yearnings and noble thoughts, but nothing pulls the psyche like a solid dose of fear. Modern Protestant Christianity largely emphasizes God's love, but removes the very importance of it by covering the sense of dread that should come from an awesome God. A Christianity based primarily on God's love appeals only to the weak-minded and sinful. Love and grace are meaningless without the fear created by the idea of punishment. Just as Dante is pulled to Beatrice by his love, so we should be aided towards God by fear of punishment. Once again, Dante shows that reason has very little power compared to emotion. Christians who think only of God's grace easily bend themselves with their own twisted mental state. One bent on commerce, one on spoliation, another fagging at his carnal pleasure, and toiled, one sprawling in idle dissipation. The natural question raised by Dante's understanding of merit-based levels in heaven is wondering if salvation is merit-based as well. The answer comes in Canto 7 of Paradiso, as Dante ventures to ask Beatrice why Jesus' death required extra atonement in the fall of Jerusalem, and why God could not simply use his unfathomable power to cancel her debt rather than his extremely personal method of becoming a human and dying for our crimes against him. Beatrice, in all her glory, replies to Dante that it was out of God's desire to connect with humans on a physical level rather than merely rational, omnipotent level. And every other means would have been less than justice if it had not pleased God's Son to be humiliate into fleshliness. Beatrice tells Dante that the reason God became a man is not because he was unable to do it in any other way, but because he needed to embody human flesh and emotion in order to restore humanity to the state when those two things were not perverted by the mind. When the God-man cracked the barrier between the mind and the flesh, that is what God deemed to be a beautiful way to prune reason of its thorns and restore balance. The further Dante climbs into heaven, the more he is able to handle Beatrice's glory. Rather than Beatrice becoming less beautiful in the light of Dante's enlightenment, she becomes more so, but with Dante able to see her. The light of God does not only illuminate himself, but it also illuminates those who follow him as well. The ability of Dante to see Beatrice as dimmer in comparison to God, but still brighter than before, is one of the most beautiful ideas contained within his vision of Christianity. Dante develops from being only able to see the logical, and being able to see even the superlogical. Dante could have made physical beauty at the bottom of his chain of development, but instead he chose to put human logic below even human desire. Dante seems rather to base his importance on the potency of the medium, rather than the nobility of it. Dante is catapulted towards God using nearly every method of human persuasion, but the highest form that brings him towards God is not the love of Beatrice, not the pursuit of knowledge, not the wisdom of God, but merely the irrational but beautiful vision of God shown in the final climax of Paradiso. The sphering this begot, perceptible in thee like mirrored light now to my view, when I had looked on it a little while, seemed in itself, and in its own self-hue, limbed with our image. For which cause mine eyes were altogether drawn and held thereto. As the geometer his mind applies to square the circle, not for all his wit finds the right formula, howe'er he tries. Dante compares the awe and love of God to the humble attempt to make a circle square. Dante does not disrespect reason, but he unlocks its true power by showing how emotion can be unleashed towards the goal of the good in conjunction with it. Dante leaves empty reason behind and comes to a harmony of the head and the chest by beginning his tale with reason and leading into irrationality of God. The progression of Dante from rational to irrational is by far the most surprising twist of the Divine Comedy, and displays the lovely connection between the heart, the head, and the God who manifested them both.
Thank you very much, young Mr. Hinrichs. And I would like you simply to begin first by explaining your title.
My title is Love Trumps Reason. So, primarily, this paper is about how the irrational is the important driver towards God that is often left out, where reason is meant to pull us towards, and love is the most predominant emotion in the Divine Comedy, Dante's love for Beatrice, which is pulling him. And so, quite literally, love does trump reason when Dante is given over to Beatrice after Virgil leaves him, and reason is no longer sufficient after a certain point.
Dante